Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
The air in the courtroom was a stagnant soup of polished wood, old paper, and the cloying scent of cheap perfume trying to mask human anxiety. It was a smell Michael had grown accustomed to over the long, grueling weeks of his trial. He sat ramrod straight at the defense table, the starched collar of his shirt feeling less like fabric and more like a mild, constant garrote. His hands were clasped on the table before him, the picture of calm composure, but beneath the fine wool of his suit jacket, a single bead of sweat traced a cold path down his spine. His lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Eleanor Vance, shuffled a final stack of notes. She leaned in, her voice a low whisper meant only for him. "Almost there, Michael. The jury has been out for less than a day. That's a good sign. They aren't bogged down in complexities because there are no complexities. The evidence is flimsy, circumstantial. They'll see that." Michael offered a slight, practiced nod. "I trust you, Eleanor." His voice was even, a smooth baritone that had soothed countless patients and, he hoped, was now soothing the last vestiges of his own frayed nerves. He was Dr. Michael Rhodes, a respected cardiothoracic surgeon at ABC General Hospital. A man who held lives in his hands daily. A healer. Not the monster the prosecution had painted him to be. The charge was murder. The victim, Juliana Smith, a socialite whose fortune was as vast as her list of enemies. She had died not on his operating table, but in a private recovery room, a victim of a sudden, catastrophic and inexplicable cardiac event. An event the prosecution alleged was induced by a carefully administered, untraceable compound, a drug only someone with Michael's specialized knowledge could procure and administer. The case against him was, as Eleanor said, circumstantial. He had been the last person to log into the hospital's pharmaceutical database to look up Juliana's file the night she died. A blurry security camera image showed a figure in surgical scrubs, of his height and build, entering the private wing around the time of death. His motive, according to the ambitious district attorney, was money. Juliana had been a major donor to the hospital, and there were whispers, unsubstantiated, vicious whispers, that Michael had been embezzling from the charitable fund she oversaw. It was a house of cards, and Eleanor had spent the trial blowing it down with methodical, brutal efficiency. The financial audit had cleared him. The security footage was inconclusive. The toxicology report, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, was a mess of contradictions, with the medical examiner himself admitting on the stand that the suspected compound broke down so rapidly post-mortem that its presence could neither be confirmed nor ruled out. The buzz in the gallery grew louder as the door beside the judge's bench opened. The bailiff stepped out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison." The room rustled to its feet. Michael rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the judge, an elderly man with a face like a crumpled paper bag and eyes that missed nothing. Then, the side door opened, and the jury filed in. Michael's heart, the very organ he had dedicated his life to understanding, hammered against his ribs. He searched their faces, a baker's dozen of his peers, looking for a tell, a smile, a frown, anything. They looked tired. They looked blank. "Will the foreperson please rise?" Judge Morrison intoned, his voice gravelly with age and authority. A woman in her late 40s, a schoolteacher named Mrs. Gable, stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a piece of paper. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The paper was passed to the bailiff, who carried it with solemn steps to the judge. The silence in the room was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on everyone. Michael felt Eleanor's hand briefly touch his arm, a fleeting gesture of solidarity. Judge Morrison read the verdict, his expression giving nothing away. He handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to Mrs. Gable. "On the count of murder in the first degree, how do you find the defendant, Michael Rhodes?" Michael held his breath. The world narrowed to the woman's mouth, to the single word that would define the rest of his life. "We find the defendant not guilty." A gasp, then a cacophony of sound erupted in the courtroom. Reporters scrambled for the door. Juliana's family cried out in anguish. Michael felt his knees buckle for a second, a wave of such profound, dizzying relief washing over him that he had to grip the table for support. Eleanor was immediately at his side, her professional demeanor cracking into a brilliant, triumphant smile. "You see," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I told you. It's over, Michael. It's finally over." He turned and pulled her into a brief, tight hug. "Thank you," he murmured into her ear, the words inadequate for the magnitude of what he felt. "Thank you for everything." The judge banged his gavel, restoring a semblance of order. "The defendant is free to go. The bailiff will escort you to processing to have your belongings returned. This court is adjourned." As the judge stood and left the bench, the room descended into controlled chaos. Michael was surrounded. Well-wishers from the hospital, colleagues who had stood by him, friends who had never doubted him. They patted his back, shook his hand, their faces blurred by his tears of relief. Through the crowd, he saw District Attorney Carl Henderson packing his briefcase, his face a thundercloud of defeat. Their eyes met for a moment, and Henderson's gaze was pure, unadulterated venom. He leaned forward, his voice a low hiss that cut through the celebratory noise. "This isn't over, Rhodes. I don't know how you did it, but I know you're guilty. I'll be watching you." Eleanor stepped between them. "That's enough, Carl. You lost. Accept it with some grace." Henderson scoffed, turned on his heel, and stalked away. "Don't let him get to you," Eleanor said, turning back to Michael. "He's a sore loser. It's over. Let's go get your things and get you out of here. You need a stiff drink and a long vacation." The bailiff, a large, stoic man named O'Malley, guided Michael through the familiar, sterile corridors of the courthouse, away from the grandeur of the courtroom and into the bureaucratic underbelly. The air here smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. They arrived at the processing office, a cramped room with a bulletproof glass window. "Just need to sign for your personal effects, Dr. Rhodes," O'Malley said, his tone neutral. "Then you're a free man." Michael nodded, a genuine smile finally touching his lips. He could feel the weight of the last year, the suspicion, the fear, the public humiliation, beginning to lift. He could go back to the hospital, back to his life, back to the operating room where he was in control, where he could fix things. The clerk behind the glass, a young woman with tired eyes, slid a clipboard and a small cardboard box through the slot. Inside were his wallet, his watch, his phone, dead from weeks of disuse, his keys, and the simple gold wedding band he always wore. He picked up the ring, the metal cool and familiar against his skin. He slipped it onto his finger, a final, symbolic act of reclaiming his identity. He signed the form with a flourish, pushing the clipboard back. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm. The clerk gave a non-committal nod. O'Malley gestured toward the door that led to the public lobby. "That's it. You can go out this way." Eleanor was waiting for him just outside the door, her phone to her ear, undoubtedly already managing the media frenzy that would be waiting on the courthouse steps. She saw him and gave a thumbs up. Michael took a deep, cleansing breath. Freedom. It tasted sweeter than he had ever imagined. He took a step, then another, toward the door, toward the rest of his life. "Dr. Rhodes?" The voice came from behind him, not O'Malley's, but new. He turned. Two men in impeccably tailored suits stood there. They hadn't been in the courtroom. They had an air of quiet, immense authority that made the courthouse bailiffs seem like mall security. "Yes?" Michael said, his smile faltering slightly. The taller of the two men, clean-shaven with icy blue eyes, stepped forward. He flipped open a leather wallet, revealing a gold badge. "I'm Agent Miller. This is Agent Collins. We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A cold knot tightened in Michael's stomach. He felt, rather than saw, Eleanor turn around, her lawyerly instincts snapping to attention. "The FBI?" Michael said, forcing a note of confused laughter into his voice. "What's this about? The trial is over. I've been acquitted." We're aware of the verdict in the state's case against you, Dr. Rhodes, Agent Miller said, his voice devoid of inflection. This is a separate federal matter. Eleanor was at his side in an instant. My client has just endured a protracted and grueling trial. He's been exonerated. If you have questions, you can direct them to my office, and we'll schedule a time. That won't be necessary, Miss Vance, Agent Collins, the shorter, stockier agent, interjected. His gaze was fixed on Michael, and it was unnervingly direct. Dr. Rhodes, we need you to come with us. Come with you where? On what grounds? Eleanor's voice was sharp, protective. Agent Miller's icy eyes didn't leave Michael's face. This isn't about the death of Juliana Smith. This is about the operations of the pharmaceutical supply chain at ABC General Hospital. This is about the systematic diversion of Schedule II narcotics. This is about a network of distribution that extends across state lines. The words hung in the air, each one a physical blow. The drug diversion scheme. The real secret. The one he had buried so deep, the one he was sure was untouchable, the one that had nothing and everything to do with Juliana's death. Michael's composure, the shield he had maintained so perfectly for so long, cracked. The blood drained from his face. He could feel it, a cold emptiness spreading from his core. I don't know what you're talking about. Michael, Eleanor whispered, her voice laced with a new, sharp fear. She was his defense attorney, but she was hearing this for the first time. She was flying blind. Agent Collins took a step closer. We have a witness, Doctor. A witness who has been working with us for some time. They've provided detailed ledgers, recorded conversations, and testimony that implicates you directly as the architect of a sophisticated drug trafficking operation operating out of the hospital's cardiac wing. A witness? It wasn't possible. He had been so careful. There were only 2 other people who knew the full extent of it, and he trusted them with his life. Or, he thought he had. Who? The word was a dry croak from Michael's throat. The doors to the lobby swung open, and a third figure stepped into the corridor. She moved with a quiet, hesitant grace, her hands clasped in front of her white lab coat, a coat bearing the insignia of ABC General Hospital. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a profound, gut-wrenching anguish, but her gaze was steady as it met Michael's. It was Sarah, his scrub nurse. His confidant. His lover. The world tilted on its axis. The secret was finally revealed, not in a dramatic confession on the stand, but in this sterile corridor, in the devastating silence between them. All the air left Michael's lungs. He stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to process the incomprehensible truth of her betrayal. Sarah, he breathed her name, a question and a plea. She didn't speak. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Agent Miller. Sarah Jennings has been our confidential informant for the past 4 months, Agent Miller stated, his voice cutting through Michael's shock like a scalpel. She came to us after the death of Juliana Smith. She was afraid, Doctor. Afraid of you. The pieces, the wrong pieces, began to click into a horrifying new picture in Michael's mind. Juliana's death hadn't been part of the plan. It had been a terrible, tragic accident. A miscalculation. A dose meant for another, diverted and mislabeled, that had found its way into the socialites for. He had covered it up, with Sarah's help. He thought they were in it together, bound by their shared sin. He never knew that her guilt had festered, that her fear had metastasized into this treachery. Michael Rhodes, Agent Miller said, his voice formal and final. You are under arrest for conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, wire fraud, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. The rest of the Miranda warning faded into a dull roar in Michael's ears. He watched as Agent Collins produced a pair of handcuffs, the steel gleaming under the fluorescent lights. This was a different kind of restraint than the one he'd worn before. This was colder, heavier. Final. He looked from the agents to Sarah, her face a mask of tortured resolve, and then to Eleanor, whose expression was one of sheer, unadulterated horror. She had fought a battle she never understood, against an enemy she never knew existed. As the cold metal of the cuffs closed around his wrists, clicking shut with a sound that echoed like a tomb ceiling, the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him. The state's case had been a shadow, a phantom. This was the substance. This was the truth. The acquittal for a murder he did, in fact, indirectly cause, was a hollow, meaningless victory. It had been nothing more than a prelude to his real damnation. The agents began to lead him away, not back into the bowels of the county jail, but toward a different, more formidable system. He was a doctor, a healer, a man who had just been declared innocent in a court of law. And yet, as he was marched past the stunned spectators and the flashing cameras that had just moments ago been celebrating his freedom, he knew the truth. His life, as he knew it, was over. The brilliant Dr. Michael Rhodes was gone, replaced by a federal inmate. The secret was out, and it had destroyed him more completely than any murder charge ever could. The journey to the federal holding facility was a blur of muted city sounds and the low hum of the government sedan's engine. Michael sat in the back, the cuffs heavy on his wrists, his mind a frantic, scrambling animal trapped in a cage of its own making. Sarah. The name echoed in his skull, a mantra of betrayal. How could he have been so blind? He replayed their last moments before his arrest for Juliana's murder, the whispered conversations in the on-call room, the frantic cover-up, her hand in his, her voice trembling but sure. We'll get through this, Michael. Together. It had all been a lie. A performance. While he was preparing his defense, she was wearing a wire. While he was trusting her with his life, she was meticulously handing it over to the FBI. They arrived at a nondescript federal building, all concrete and tinted glass. The processing was more efficient, more impersonal than at the county jail. He was fingerprinted, photographed, his expensive suit exchanged for a coarse, standard-issue jumpsuit. The color was a dull khaki, the fabric scratching against his skin, a constant, tactile reminder of his new status. He was no longer a defendant in a high-profile murder trial, he was a number in the federal system. He was placed in a solitary holding cell, a concrete cube with a stainless steel toilet and a narrow bench. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant clang of another door or the muffled echo of a voice over an intercom. This was where they left him to stew, to let the reality of his situation sink in. Hours, or maybe only minutes, later, the cell door clanked open. Agent Miller stood there. Your lawyer is here. Follow me. Eleanor was waiting in a small, stark interrogation room. She looked like she had aged a decade since the courtroom. Her sharp, professional composure was gone, replaced by a raw, furious energy. She waited until the door clicked shut behind Agent Miller. What in God's name is this, Michael? She demanded, her voice low and shaking. Drug trafficking? Racketeering? Were you ever going to tell me? Eleanor, Don't, she snapped, holding up a hand. Don't you dare lie to me now. I stood in front of a jury and argued for your innocence. I believed you. I believed in you. And the whole time you were, what? A drug lord? It wasn't like that, he said, the words sounding feeble even to his own ears. Then what was it like, Michael? Enlighten me. Because from where I'm sitting, the FBI has a star witness who is your partner in crime, and they have enough evidence to put you away for 30 years. The murder charge was a sideshow. This is the main event. He slumped into the metal chair, the fight draining out of him. What was the point of denial now? The secret was out. Sarah had seen to that. It started small, he began, his voice a hollow whisper. A few vials of fentanyl, some dilaudid. The waste logs are a joke, no one ever checks them properly. I'd sign out more than a patient needed, document the waste, and pocket the difference. It was easy money at first. Just to get ahead. Get ahead? Eleanor echoed, her voice dripping with disbelief. You're a top-tier surgeon. Your salary is astronomical. It's never enough, is it? He said, a bitter smile twisting his lips. The alimony to 2 ex-wives, the mortgage on the penthouse, the gambling debts. It started as a way to plug the holes. But then, the demand. I had a system. A network. I never touched the drugs myself. I just facilitated. I was the source. He told her about the intermediaries, the distributors who operated in the city's shadows. He explained how he used his position and authority to bypass security protocols, how he created false patient records to justify the massive quantities of narcotics he was ordering. It was a sophisticated, lucrative operation that had been running smoothly for nearly 3 years. And Juliana Smith? Eleanor asked, her tone glacial. Was her death part of getting ahead? No. The word burst from him, sharp with genuine pain. That was an accident. A terrible, stupid accident. A batch was mislabeled. A syringe meant for a distributor was swapped with one for a patient. It was supposed to be saline. It was a massive dose of synthetic adrenaline, designed to mimic a heart attack. Untraceable. I used it for other purposes. To create diversions. But it was never meant for her. Never. He looked up at Eleanor, his eyes pleading for an understanding he knew he didn't deserve. When she died, I panicked. Sarah helped me cover it up. We altered the records, we deleted the digital trail. I thought we were in it together. I thought she was as terrified as I was. And all the while, she was building a case against you, Eleanor finished, her anger subsiding into a weary, professional calculation. She paced the small room. She must have gone to the feds right after it happened. She saw a murder charge on the horizon and decided to cut a deal. She gave them you to save herself. The logic was impeccable. It was the only thing that made sense. Sarah had chosen self-preservation. The realization was a fresh wound, deeper and more painful than the handcuffs or the jumpsuit. So, what now? Michael asked, his voice barely audible. Now? Eleanor stopped pacing and faced him, her expression grim. Now we face a federal prosecutor with a mountain of evidence and a cooperating witness who is your right hand. The double jeopardy clause protects you from being tried again for Juliana's murder, but it doesn't protect you from this. This case is a slam dunk for them, Michael. Our only play is to try and cut a deal. A plea bargain. A plea bargain? The term sounded so clinical, so final. You are going to prison, Michael, she said, her voice devoid of any sugarcoating. There is no not guilty verdict waiting for you at the end of this tunnel. The question is not if, but for how long. Our job now is to minimize the sentence. We need to give them something. Names. Details of your distribution network. Everything. He stared at the gray tabletop, the reality of her words settling like a lead weight in his soul. Prison. Not the relatively cushy white-collar facility he might have faced for embezzlement, but a hardened federal prison for drug trafficking. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all of it was gone. Think about it, Eleanor said, her hand on the door. I'll be back tomorrow. We have a lot of work to do. She left him alone in the silent room, the ghost of his confession hanging in the air. He had unburdened himself, but there was no catharsis, only a deeper, more profound despair. The secret was out, and it had cost him everything. The days that followed were a monotonous hell of legal strategy sessions and crushing isolation. Eleanor worked tirelessly, negotiating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Michael, stripped of his identity and his future, provided everything he knew. He gave up the names of his distributors, the drop points, the financial routes. He laid bare his entire operation, trading the remnants of his criminal empire for the hope of a slightly shorter sentence. The media, of course, had a field day. Hospital Hero 2 drug kingpin, the headlines screamed. Acquitted doctor faces real justice. The public that had briefly sympathized with him during the murder trial now reviled him. He was a monster in a white coat, a hypocrite of the highest order. Through it all, one face haunted him, Sarah's. He dreamed of her, of the way she would smile at him across the operating table, of the quiet intimacy they had shared. He hated her with a ferocity that frightened him, but intertwined with that hatred was a sick, twisted thread of understanding. What would he have done in her position? Faced with a murder charge, would he have turned on her? He liked to think he wouldn't have, but he could no longer trust his own moral compass. It had been broken long ago. The federal courthouse, for his arraignment and subsequent plea hearing, was a different beast than the state one. It was colder, more efficient, less concerned with drama and more with the cold application of the law. He stood before a federal judge, a woman with a stern, no-nonsense demeanor, and pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to distribute narcotics and 1 count of wire fraud. The racketeering charge was dropped as part of the deal. The sentencing hearing was a formality. Victim impact statements were read, though the victims were faceless, the addicts who had been fed by his pipeline, the families destroyed by the drugs he had put on the street. It was abstract, and yet devastating. Then, the judge spoke. Dr. Rhodes, you have committed a profound betrayal of trust. You took an oath to do no harm, and you wielded your privileged position not to heal, but to feed a scourge that is poisoning our communities. You are not a street-level dealer, you are an architect. Your actions demand significant punishment. She looked down at the paperwork before her. It is the judgment of this court that you are hereby sentenced to a term of 22 years in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The number hit him like a physical blow. 22 years. He would be in his late 60s when he was released. His life was over. He was led from the courtroom, back to the holding cell, and eventually transferred to a federal penitentiary. The processing there was the final stripping of his identity. He was assigned a number. He was issued a uniform. He was marched through a series of gates that clanged shut behind him, each one a louder, more final declaration of his new reality. The prison yard was a concrete expanse under a sky that seemed grayer than the one on the outside. Inmates milled about, their eyes assessing, categorizing. He saw the groups, the white supremacists with their tattoos, the gang members with their specific colors, the loners who kept to the edges. He found a vacant spot on a metal bench and sat, the weight of his sentence pressing down on him. He was Dr. Michael Rhodes, a man who had once commanded the respect of his peers, who had held the beating hearts of patients in his hands. Now, he was just inmate #79834B. A number. A cautionary tale. He looked down at his hands, the skilled, steady hands of a surgeon. They were clean, but he felt the phantom stain of his actions upon them. He had thought the secret was about the money, the drugs, the power. He had thought it was about the accidental death of a patient. But as he sat there, surrounded by the bleak concrete and the hardened faces of men he would now call his neighbors, he understood the real secret that had been revealed. It wasn't about the crimes he had committed. It was about the man he had always been, lurking beneath the surface of the respected doctor. A man who was capable of breathtaking arrogance, of profound moral failure, of betraying the very essence of his oath. The trial, the arrest, the sentence, they hadn't created this man. They had simply unmasked him. The secret was finally revealed, and it was the most terrifying thing of all. He was exactly who the world now saw him to be. And he would have the next 22 years to stare that truth in the face, every single day.